friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 16 of the MC Lars podcast. It is December 17th, 2018. Christmas Eve is a week away, and that is tight as heck. I've been in California. I've been catching up with a lot of friends, doing a lot of podcasts, traveling, enjoying the sunshine, and just appreciating everything this beautiful state has to offer. Another thing is that I've been able to do is catch up with my family. And those of you might know, my dad is also, he's a writer and he's a photographer, but he's done some rap stuff. We did a song together. He's on the Indie Rocket Science mixtape. We did a song called Soledad. And so on this episode, I talked to him about his family history, some of our memories of the first tour. At one point it gets kind of emotional. I think about my grandpa and how we spread his ashes under the Golden Gate Bridge, and how when I drive over it, I think about him. And it was really a cool topic. Like it struck me how interesting my dad's career was, both as a lawyer and as a creative person. So this is my episode with MC Bob Nielsen on the MC Lars podcast. Check it out. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the MC Lars podcast. I have a man here with whom I have a lot in common. In fact, I share 50% of his human genome. Ladies and gentlemen, this is MC Bob Nielsen. You've seen him at Warped Tour with me. You've heard him on my albums. You heard us on Zombie Dinosaur LP and Indie Rocket Science. And I was wondering, Dad, would you be down to read one of your poems?
Sure. Happy to. What about Highway 68?
Oh, a classic.
A classic. It's often requested. Highway 68. She drove up beside me. Our windows were down. Tight-fitting jeans, the song on her radio. FM. K-Tom. Country. Insurance by Smith & Wesson, the sign on her rear window below the gun rack, which carried a long red umbrella. California Rodeo, her bumper sticker. So, too, her Stetson and the color of the shirt she wore. Rodeo week, big week in Salinas. The light changed. She shot ahead and out in front. And in the side mirror of her black Chevy truck, I could see her gum-chewing smile, smooth, soft skin, big brown eyes, auburn hair, and 1,000 curls, and love for someone. She winked at me in the mirror and accelerated down the road to town.
That's a great poem.
Thanks.
You do a lot of poetry readings around the Monterey Peninsula, right?
I do. There's a group called the Monterey Bay Poetry Consortium, which is a loosely affiliated group of poets in the Monterey area and up in Santa Cruz. And we have a monthly poetry reading in Monterey at Old Capitol Books. And I host that. It's my privilege and task to be the MC, and when I'm not here, there are other fellow poets who cover for me. So, yeah, and that's a monthly immersion, if you will, into some great poetry by local poets.
Have you seen 8 Mile, Eminem's movie?
Oh, gosh, yes. Years and years ago, yeah.
One of his friends is this guy, Papa Doc, who hosts the ciphers, the battles. And when Eminem wins, he gets offered that position, to be the host. And he's working on his music and he's not quite ready. That's not what he wants. Mm-hmm. Seems like that's a position that would go to a veteran writer and performer. How did you get asked to be the host of that?
Well, the guy who organizes all of this is a fellow named John Lowy, and he's a poet and a retired teacher. And this was a few years ago now, probably 7 or 8 years ago. He just asked me if I would take over from the person who was doing it. And I said, sure. And at first I really started to prepare and get all uptight and make sure that the readings were perfectly, went well. But we've gotten more mellow. I've gotten more mellow and relaxed, and it's a great, fun experience.
I mean, a group like that, I think it's similar to me and the Nerdcore guys, right? Like having people to share your songs with and to collaborate with and have a reason for us coming together and doing our performances and writing is a very profound catalyst, I would say.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. we don't have huge crowds generally, but we have good-sized audiences. And yeah, in fact, I came away from last Sunday's reading uh, inspired to do some writing of some poetry myself and also write some of the prose of the book I'm working on. It is a catalyst. It does do that. And there was a couple of lines that one of the poets said on this last reading that stuck with me. And it was that learning is about adding, wisdom is about subtracting. And I thought that was a nice way to put things. And actually, he didn't say learning; he said knowledge is about adding, wisdom is about subtracting. And so that was interesting, and that was my takeaway from a nice afternoon of poetry.
I was talking to Spose on his podcast, and we talked about the role of the producer in making an album, and the role of a good producer is really about subtracting, adding that wisdom. You go to a veteran kind of sensei in music with all your ideas, and he or she will be like, okay, these ones are good, focus on these, and not to throw the other ones out, but to be like trying to find a cohesive vision by editing down what you've created. And it seems like that's a big part of being a artist who does something of quality, and something you've always done since I was a baby is every day you sit and write in your journal when you've had time.
Mm-hmm.
And you've created this incredible log of your life. And it's interesting that it's 50 volumes.
Oh gosh, I don't, running out of space in the garage for these things. I have, I've journaled a lot, and there's some therapy in journaling, but there's also it's a wonderful way to have a conversation with a patient piece of paper that's waiting for you. I journal with a pen, and heaven knows what's going to happen when I leave the planet. Maybe we just have to make a deal that all this stuff gets shredded, because gosh knows, there's a lot of stuff.
There's a lot of, I mean, I part of me is curious to read them one day, but the other part of me is very respectful of your privacy and maybe reading our greatest hits.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's interesting. Maybe the greatest hits approach is the way to do it. I remember the Spose interview, and also your podcast with Eamon Dolan. He talked a lot about subtracting and coming down to the essence. And the greatest hits would certainly and clearly be the essence. The issue is, of course, who's got the time to go through and distill and make the greatest hits.
You're in the process of subtraction, creating a memoir about your time abroad in college, right?
Yeah, I was fortunate to go to overseas campus when I was in college, and it was spring and summer of my end of my sophomore, beginning of my junior year in France. And this was in 1964. And the world was so very different back then. It was a coming of age experience for me. It was like a renaissance, a rebirth of myself off there in another culture, another country, a different language. And I'd changed countries before because I was born and raised in Australia, as you know, and came here in high school. But yes, it was wonderful. And at the same time, Europe was undergoing a renaissance. This was, less than 20 years after the end of World War II. And Europe was being reborn. France was, and I was. So it was a remarkable time. And this book I'm working on, I think the genre is creative nonfiction dash memoir.
Kerouac style.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Exactly. Well, it's I don't know if there are any Dharma bums in this one, but there is. Yeah, it is that. It's kind of picaresque in a way. We traveled around Europe, and America was so much in the ascendancy back then. We were so respected and loved. Just a couple of little incidents. My first morning in Tours, which is this smallish city in the Loire Valley where our campus was, I got up early and walked around and with another guy from my group, and little kids came running up, and they could recognize, I guess, we were Americans, and they were saying they were like 6, 7, 8 years old. Des Américains, des Américains. They wanted to come up and touch us and shake our hands, and that was really kind of amazing. Americans were respected, and when we were there for the 20th anniversary of the D-Day landings, so we drove up to Normandy we stayed the night at an old German blockhouse on Omaha Beach, slept on the sand, wrapped up in our overcoats, and the next morning went out and saw the beach just totally empty, as it must have been that morning when the Germans looked out and saw the fleet arriving of all those ships. And we went to some ceremonies, and they weren't a big deal back then. There was a band in one village, and we stood there and watched and observed, and people came up to us and shook our hands and thanked us. These were people, this was 1964, so these were people in their 40s, 50s, 60s. They remembered the liberation of France. And it was a remarkable experience to be an American, to be from this worshipped and wonderful country, and to be respected and honored there in Europe.
And it's interesting the connection that your father, my grandfather, fought in World War II and wrote a book about it. And
Yeah.
the Aussie support too is part of the Allied forces.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Americans, I think, the predominant landing force on Omaha Beach was American, but I think the predominant landing forces on Sword and Juno beaches, which we also visited, were British and British Commonwealth, Canadians, Australians, and yeah, and my dad was in the Royal Air Force in Bomber Command, and he, the Blitz started against England with the night bombing of London and other cities, and so the Brits retaliated, and my dad was in an all-Australian crew that flew out every night, or not every night, but every 1 or 2 or 3 nights, and bombed targets in Germany. But they also bombed targets in France, in Saint-Nazaire, out on the west coast, the Atlantic coast, where the Germans had built this huge, almost impregnable submarine base, and my dad's squadron bombed that. And most of those guys didn't make it. I think it was something like almost 70% of the crews was shot down, and my father miraculously survived. One of his mates, my mom's fiance, didn't make it, was shot down over Belgium, and I bear his middle name. I mean, his name is my middle name, Raymond. And so my dad was doing that, and then your other grandfather, he was a pharmacist and he came ashore at Omaha Beach about 2 months after the landing, I think in August, or maybe shorter than that, maybe 6 weeks. And he said it was raining, and I've read that it rained a lot that summer in France. And he spent the night, several nights, in a pup tent, trying to stay dry while the troops were advancing through Normandy. And then he ultimately ended up behind them and was assigned to be the sergeant in charge of a hospital train that went into Germany and brought out wounded people. And also in some runs, they brought out people released from the concentration camps who were, Grandpa said they were just walking skeletons. And some of them didn't make it. Some of them didn't live.
It's interesting. It's interesting thinking about when you were in France for part of your college education. It was like 20 years-ish before. You're saying it was the 20-year anniversary of D-Day.
Yeah.
That's like, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11.
Yeah.
Which doesn't feel, that feels not too far in the past. And it's interesting that you also talked about you went to Berlin and you were able to go over the other side of the wall, right? And
yeah.
That was interesting part of your story.
Yeah, we went behind the Iron Curtain. We actually, one of my roommates had a VW and with German tourist plates on it, and we drove it, eastward from France through Switzerland and Austria and up through, and then behind the Iron Curtain through Czechoslovakia to East Germany, and then came into Berlin from the east, which was a very unusual way of entry back then. And in fact, when we tried to leave to drive west to go back out to West Germany, they wouldn't let us. We had to park the car somewhere in West Berlin and walk back into East Berlin and get our appropriate stamps on our visas and our passports. And we were behind the Iron Curtain, and it really was a time it was the Cold War. Weirdly, we were young, and I think could get away with being just ourselves. The police, we almost got into a collision with a car full of looked like Russian generals in Dresden, and they glared at us, but then they waved at us and smiled and things like that. And we crossed into West Berlin through and then back into East Berlin one other time, and then the time we had to leave through what's called Checkpoint Charlie. And it's now, I've seen pictures of it with the wall down. It's now a kind of a museum. Yeah, amazing stories. I mean, we showed up, the entry into East Germany was at night, and we drove through this series of barricades and barbed wire fences and lights glaring at us and guys with these huge machine guns standing around. And they were not much older than me. And we got out of the car and walked up the hill to this place where we had to get visaed and stamped in. And what's coming out of the door, which was open, but the Beatles playing. And there was so much universality there. And so, it was quite an experience.
What do you think were some of the reasons why the generation after your generation, Generation X, why do you think they felt this disillusionment and disenfranchisement that, you talk about the joy and the excitement of that period and how you guys, it seems like they saw you as this symbol of the optimistic hope for the future. When did that switch? And do you know what I mean? Why did Generation X have this gloomier outlook, do you think?
I don't know. The world is so changed. It's not in vogue to be optimistic anymore. I think we had come out of my generation had come out of growing up with parents who weathered the Depression and World War II, and there was, I think, there was disillusionment. The existentialists, the French existentialists were kind of a gloomy bunch, but there was a sense of confidence and hope, I think, certainly that the future could be something that could even be made better. People tried. The culture was I think committed to the notion of trying to make things better. We were in Berlin when Bobby Kennedy spoke on the first anniversary of his brother's Ich bin ein Berliner speech, and we got a marvelous view from a balcony of an apartment house that looked over on the town hall square, Rathausplatz, and these Berliners, said, "Come on up," and we stood there, and they served us Berliner Weisse, which is beer with a little cherry juice in it, and we stood there, and Bobby just, worked up the crowd just by repeating his brother's Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner. And so I think there was this optimism and positiveness, and we had people like Viktor Frankl, the survivor of the Holocaust, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. I remember studying that in college, and there was this, and I was always struck by Dr. Rieu, Camus' main character in his novel The Plague, La Peste, about how you keep going, you don't give up, and that sort of, I think, faded a bit. I don't think it went away, but I think as we became more prosperous and didn't have to worry about material things as much, could take things for granted, I think that we kind of lost the spark of optimism. But I don't know. It's a complex question, and I wouldn't, wouldn't denigrate Gen X. The Gen X people are wonderful, and they're part of your fan base. And in talking to, when I've gone on the road with you, talking to your fans, people in Gen X, I've always been impressed by their good nature and their desire to just reach out and connect and not get too worked up by things. So,
Yeah, my fan base is a special cross section
yes,
of optimistic people, and I think a lot of my optimism and the values that come through my music and my storytelling come from you and Mom. And I think that it was a process of, after high school, trying to differentiate myself, but then piece together what you guys taught that resonated with me, and be like, oh, Mom and Dad were right. And now having this friendship with you guys that's very much like adult friendship, it's cool. And it's very clear that you've been very supportive of my music. You came on the first tour to England. You were the tour manager.
Yeah, I love that. That was great.
Because I was 20 and Truck Records had booked shows all around the UK, and maybe it wouldn't have made sense for me to figure it all out by train and rental cars. So you had some time, and you came and we mapped it out, and it was pretty. I'll never forget that. And what are some of your memories from that tour?
Oh, it was great fun. I remember riding the train up to it was to the north, and it was to Newcastle maybe. And in those trains, you could spread out. So I spread out papers all over the desk, and we worked on receipts and bills and itineraries. I remember you had a show in London, and the fans from the opening band, which was a local band, didn't stick around, which was not very cool. And that was a hard show for you, but you went on and you did fantastically. And then we went out and had strawberry ice cream afterwards to sort of just get beyond it. And then the last show down in Brighton was a triumph. There were hundreds and hundreds of people there. And I remember we drove back up that night from Brighton to Heathrow, and we stopped at a roadside burger place on the way and got burgers and sandwiches. And I haven't felt a lot in life, but I certainly did then, just a moment with you of shared complete contentment over a tour well done and wrapped up so beautifully.
Yeah, that I remember it was because pre-social media, Truck Records was respected, and that was what was branded on the posters. MC Lars Horace, rapper from America on Truck Records.
Yeah.
And the shows that did well were shows that had other bands on the bill that had a local audience.
Yeah.
Or the Oxford show did well because I'd built an audience there while I was a student.
Yeah.
And some of the shows we played the sound man and one other person. And I remember the London one, it was a political group there called Weapons of Mass Belief, a play on the George W. Bush weapons of mass destruction stuff. And they were very political, and it felt it was exciting because it was packed. I was like, oh, these people are going to stay around. And they didn't say stick around for MC Lars Horace, and everyone just dipped. And I remember that. And playing to the label people and you and like one other person who'd been a student at Oxford who was there, and realizing that you can't take things for granted, and that it was just special to be able to play London. And then 2 years later, less than 3 years later, I headlined there, and I remember I had like 400 people.
Yeah, was that the underground place with the pink walls?
It was 93 Feet East.
This one where the show wasn't so well attended.
Yeah, and it was this cool feeling that I'd been there with you, and when The Graduate came out, and there was this groundswell, that it made sense. And it was so much about timing, and we stayed positive, and having you there as a friend, and helping with all the logistics. That tour led to everything. That show was the show in Brighton was part of this weekend show, the Punker Bunker punk shows.
Yeah, right.
And I was the one rapper on a show full of hardcore and bands, and they liked it, and that we filmed it. You filmed my set with the crowd there. I crowd surfed and everything, and that video is what we sent when I first started talking to my first management company. That video was like, look, he can perform, and people see him over there. And my career would not have happened if for not for that tour. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me. It was great fun.
You also made friends with all the bands. You were very friendly,
Yes.
and they were impressed to meet you. I remember that.
Yeah, it was good fun. And, I won't speak literally on this podcast, but, because there was a lot of cuss words. But I remember this Scotsman, talking about how you were really going to rock them in Glasgow. And when you would come there, because you didn't on that tour, and you eventually did, and you did rock them. And they loved you. And it was great. I have this marvelous collection of EPs and CDs that I would buy from all of these bands that they would autograph. And, I hope they've gone on to success. But it was always fun to talk with them and connect and pick up their music.
And it was a cool time because the act of being able to just tour without really, without having had a hit or anything was, I think, impressive to people, and I think that was 2003. That was so long ago. And when I took senior year off to go out with Bowling for Soup and finished college in 3 years, you and Mom were supportive. What were you thinking when I told you I was trying to do this stuff?
Well, we were a little mixed. We were excited because Bowling for Soup, Jared and all the guys were wonderful people. We'd met them. And Jared had made a point of telling Mom that, don't worry, he's going to be safe. And don't worry, he's going to finish college. And we were trusting that would be the case. But, you'd spent 3 years at college and done well and learned, and then it was just going to be 1 quarter you were going to be out. Then it stretched to 2, then it stretched to 3, and you said not to worry. You had enough AP classes and credits from high school that all you needed to do was take 18 units in the summer after your senior year, and you would get your diploma and a degree. And yes, that's exactly what happened. You didn't get to walk because you were on tour in Australia, but you did finish and you did get your degree, and our faith in you was once again vindicated.
I could just see an alternate universe, which similarly totally reasonable parents would be like, no, you're not doing that Bowling for Soup tour. If it's for real, you could do a future tour, get your degree. But I would have not had that crazy see the whole U.S. experience that was really formative, and they had their hit that spring, and it was I really appreciated you guys had faith in me. And only later did I learn about your trepidation, because you put on a very supportive face, and my manager had been very clear to let you guys know that I was going to finish college, and that we were capitalizing on this moment in popular culture where rap was diversifying, and the samples I was using kind of had this cultural cachet that a year later, the groundswell would maybe not have carried as far as it had. That tidal wave was coming and going, right? And
yeah, Mom and I saw that. I think we felt that. And, there is a considerable amount of guidance from the universe that happens in one's life if one lets it. And I think we were all guided to have you do that, not stand in the way, because it just seemed to be a marvelous opportunity, and it turned out to be so.
And looking back, I think about how the business team, even though many of those people I don't work with, really made sure that it was worth my while. It wasn't. I remember in the fall we were supposed to do a tour, and I ended up touring with Gym Class Heroes, and it was they hadn't had any of their bigger songs, so it was this small tour, and that they were like, well, we're going to get you something after, and they did, and I think that kind of validated the time. But then again, if they hadn't, I would have gone back to school right away. So it's not like it's not like I would have, I don't know, been stranded. I could have always just gone back. And that was shout out to Stanford, because they had a very lenient stopping out policy in favor of people who are doing tech startups or whatever. You could take time off and come back within a reasonable period. And even if you took longer, you could register and come back and finish. Like they wanted to make sure that their alumni got their degrees, and that was pretty cool. And rest in peace to Professor Jay Fliegelman, because I did a independent literary study with him that summer that fulfilled one of my modern American literature core requirements that wasn't being offered. So I did a directed reading, and he's on the Ahab single. There's an interview with him as a bonus track, and that was cool. And he passed the next year, and I just felt, it was, the college experience was really conducive to they were rigorous, but they also were flexible. And as an alum of we went to the same university, what was Stanford like for you?
It was not as flexible, but it clearly was a place where you were encouraged to reach out and experience and expand as much as you could. And were I to go to college now with all that I know now, I would have reached out even more than I did. But I think a singular thing back then was the Overseas Campus Program. It was very innovative and very far-reaching, and they basically transported a piece of Stanford to France, and one in Germany, and one in the UK, and one in Italy. And you had Stanford professors go over and teach along with local professors, and you had, in France, we had 40 men and 40 women, which was a marvelous ratio because back on campus in Palo Alto back then, the guys outnumbered the women, I think like 2 to 1 or something like that. So Stanford was very flexible, and I think that for its time, and it certainly became more so now, and it encouraged you to do what you did, and you went back and and Professor Fliegelman, I remember we went to his memorial service. He was a beloved teacher and a great guide to you, and I remember you. I think you were in a dorm on campus. That's where the "Roommate from Hell" song came from, right?
Yeah. That last summer, while I was taking my classes, I finished the graduate record.
Yes, yeah.
And I had a roommate who was difficult, and people were sneaking into our dorm, and not to be too crass, they were leaving bottles of urine in our freezer because they didn't like him, or it was him or something, and I just had to switch dorms, and that was some stress of the last quarter. Being in college during the summer had its own challenges, but it also had a flexibility to it,
And it's a gorgeous place to be during the summer. The weather's fantastic, and it's a mellow place.
Yeah, it's people get nostalgic about their college experience, and I was in a rush to get out and tour, but I would have stayed in probably in another universe, had done my master's. You could just sign on for a fifth year master's, but I'm really glad that I've maintained friendships with faculty there and keep going back, and it's a special place. So shout out to Stanford for opening doors for both of us.
Yeah. Shout out to Stanford.
Dad, what were so you were an economics major, right?
Yeah, econ. Did the honors econ, and then almost a minor in history. I didn't have the quite enough units, but yeah, was econ with history.
And when did you decide you wanted to be a corporate lawyer? Where did that come about?
Oh gosh, I've always been interested in the way things work, and it seemed to me that the law was a way to be involved with making things work, and it was also back then kind of a practical avenue to follow. I think the times back then were that you graduated, got a job, et cetera, et cetera. And in our case, being immigrants coming from Australia as we did, we were sort of, it was inculcated within us to really live and pursue the American dream, succeed. And, my parents had come out of, as I mentioned, the World War II and the Depression, so they were motivated that way. And so the law was a good way to apply yourself to be successful. And I chose corporate law. Really, it was international business law because I was fascinated by the way things worked in the world. And I had a good career doing an awful lot of international business work in different countries and with different cultures, and helping to make things happen, and helping to make things happen in the right way, too. The law can be twisted and manipulated, but it really is a good set of guideposts for human behavior if properly applied and followed. And so it was a good way to make things happen the right way in the environment that I was in.
And you worked for some interesting companies, and you traveled a lot. I remember you would be on the road doing these deals
Yeah.
when we were kids.
Yeah, I did. I got out of law school and had what they call a clerkship in the federal court in Los Angeles, and then joined a firm in San Francisco, and was recruited out of there after a couple of years by a company that was based in Honolulu and San Francisco, and it's now known as Dole. Dole pineapples and bananas and all of that stuff. And we had a different name back then, Castle and Cook, and we were a more diversified multinational conglomerate. And I was based in Honolulu and San Francisco, and our operations were worldwide, and we were involved in all kinds of things, computer software and retail stores and fruits and vegetables and seafood and stuff. So I got to work in a lot of places around the world, and not the normal sort of big deal kind of places like London and Paris and Berlin, although I did, of course, but in obscure little countries like Kiribati, which is a tiny island nation in the middle of the Pacific, centered on the island of Tarawa, and in Suriname, which used to be Dutch Guiana, right in the steamy jungles of South America, and those were fascinating. The people were amazing, and I was constantly impressed by the skill and the energy and the education of the people I worked with. You'd be in this tiny little country that's totally off the mainstream, and took you a day and a half and 3 different flights and airlines to get there. And here's someone who's gone to grad school at University of Pennsylvania. And I was so impressed by the folks I work with in the Philippines and in Thailand. The finance guys were incredibly good and well-trained financial people. And there was this universality that was happening in the world, and it was great. I remember coming in from the airport, on the airport, a little bus, which is really more like a truck, from the airport outside Paramaribo, which is the capital of Suriname. The bus would stop along the way, and people would get off, and it stopped, and this was at night, it stopped at one place, and a young man with his sort of big backpack on his back got off, but clutched in his arm was a vinyl LP, and it was Simon and Garfunkel. And here's this young man getting off in this dusty middle of the night bus stop with one light and flies buzzing around and moths in the light. And he got off the bus and walked off into the jungle with this Simon and Garfunkel LP. And I thought, my goodness, how universal things are and how connected we are.
It was globalization was.
Yeah, in a good sense.
Yeah.
The downside of globalization is the homogenization that it can create. But I think in a good sense, in a good way, it connects people, and it also has to, and it can, honor the differences and the uniquenesses and the richness of each culture and each individual, really, within that culture.
What was San Francisco like in the 80s, and how do you think it's changed 40 years later?
Oh, gosh. Well, I can go back to San Francisco really even before then, when we first came to America, and it was a small town, really. It was tightly knit and socially. The law firm I joined after my clerkship was well wired into the fabric of San Francisco, and this was in 1972. And there were there were norms of behavior. If you came into San Francisco in the 1960s and you were a woman, you dressed up, you wore gloves, and you didn't wear white high heels in the summer, even though it was summer, but you wore dark ones because San Francisco got foggy and cold as if it were winter. I mean, there were these norms. There was this marvelous columnist in the Chronicle, Herb Cain, who recorded sort of life in the city. And there were companies there that have since gone bankrupt or taken over, been taken over or disappeared or moved out. And so it was a very powerful financial and corporate and business center, and a lot of California's agribusiness and natural resources businesses funneled through San Francisco. And of course, Southern Pacific, the railroad giant, was headquartered there. And there was an undercurrent of bohemianism in San Francisco, which had been there long before, and it was surfacing and bubbling up. And Herb Cain helped stoke that.
And he coined the term beatnik.
Exactly, because the beat generation was there, and Ferlinghetti and those guys were up in North Beach at City Lights. And I remember we'd go up to North Beach for lunch, have a great spaghetti lunch somewhere, and then go back to the office. And I was young, very young, and it was and also too, San Francisco has always historically been more tolerant of diversity, although kind of racist and restrictive in some ways. But gay pride and gay movement, of course, started there, and I can remember the old guard reacting so negatively to it. Herb Cain even was hostile to it, and then some friends of his illuminated him, and he came out very much in favor of the gay movement. And so then the city opened up and had the Summer of Love and Haight-Ashbury and all of that. And people that I know who are in that scene, and I wasn't, said that it sort of came off the rails and it got self-indulgent and the drug culture moved in. But San Francisco was exciting and beautiful. It still is. It's a marvelous, fantastic city.
There's a great Robert Crumb cartoon where he, I recommend the audience to check this out. It's about the aftermath of the 60s. And he has, there's a compilation of cartoons called On the Crest of the Wave. And he talks about how the Haight-Ashbury kind of became this place of darkness and the zombies and the weird resonance of the Manson stuff and and how these people who had taken too much acid ended up. And it's interesting, Dad, because you're an artistic, I would say, bohemian guy. We haven't even touched on your photography career and your award-winning photos and your prolific vision. And you have been a guide to me as someone who balanced your duty with your creative spirit. And I think that to be a successful artist, you can't just make art. You have to surround yourself with the structure that allows you to be able to create and relax into it and not panic about what you're doing. And I think that you were living in a place where you could have been distracted and done your art and maybe gone and taken acid, and no disrespect to people who've experimented with that. But I guess your work ethic, that came from your family and being an Australian immigrant, you think?
I think so. Australia, where I grew up, and just so folks know, we came to America twice. We came when I was 10 years old for my dad to get a PhD at UC Berkeley, and then 3 years later we went back to Australia and then settled back into life there. And my dad's job opportunities were better in the U.S., so a year or so later we moved back to America, and so that was in high school, and we moved to Los Gatos to what was then called the Santa Clara Valley. It wasn't Silicon Valley. But, growing up in Australia, that was a very Victorian Edwardian culture. And I think there was a lot of this discipline and self-discipline expressed or inculcated in people. And so I think that was kind of the motivator. My best friend in college is from Kansas, a remarkable guy. And, he and I got along and do get along very well because I think our roots were similar. The Australian culture and the Midwestern American culture, there is a lot of commitment to doing what you need to do and doing it right. But, that can be stultifying. And I saw, part of me had this need to go beyond that, certainly to go beyond the law and its constraints, and to be creative and express. And I always, I think, since I was a kid, was always fascinated by the world and wanted to record it and reflect back to the world, to people in it, my take on it. And I remember when we moved back to Australia after living in Berkeley, I, with my paper route money, bought a 35 millimeter camera, which ultimately I took to France and so forth. And it was a great way to connect and express. And I think that it's hard to strike a balance, but to your point that you need to have sort of a structure around your art making, I think that's very true. And otherwise, you end up being, no, you don't necessarily, but one can end up being the starving artist in the garret, in poor health and not eating well, and maybe some folks tripping out and stuff like that. That is, it rarely results in the person who's making the art being satisfied and content. And I think even more rarely does it result in quote good art, unquote, being put out there. So I think you have to have a structure. And a good example of that is Claude Monet, the French impressionist. He was a daring painter, and he and the other guys, including Gustave Caillebotte, who was one of his very close friends, broke through the walls of the Academy, the Salon system in France, and but they had structure. They had a context in which their material needs were taken care of, and within that context, which was not confining or narrow, but was large, they then were free to create. And Caillebotte, in fact, who died young, was the son of a very wealthy French industrialist, and Caillebotte is a marvelous painter in his own right. Caillebotte helped bankroll Monet and Renoir and those guys. And I think, the challenge is to have that structure and, give us this day our daily bread sort of stuff being taken care of, and not to obsess with that and not to, greedily want more and more and more, but to have a structure, and then within that structure of your needs being taken care of, including your family's needs, then you're free to create, and then making sure you do create, taking the time daily to create and express, if for no other reason than to satisfy yourself, but also maybe to reach out to other people and maybe to express some things to other people that you think, and they in turn agree, they would like to see or hear, in the case of music, for example.
Well, and you've built like we talked about, your writing group, your photography groups that you've connected with. And as people who know my story, I grew up in the Bay Area in Oakland, and then we moved to the Monterey Peninsula and right before middle school. And I saw this resurgence in you of your creativity during that period. And do you think it was what led to that? And were you involved in like poetry and photography groups in the Bay Area? Because I don't remember that.
No, that's a very good question. One could be tempted to say, well, it's in the water in the Monterey area, but it was not that. I think it was moving down to an area that really does have a strong local tradition of art making. Back up in the Bay Area, I had discovered Zen and was getting involved with that in the East Bay in Berkeley and Oakland. This is in the late 80s. And there were some poetry groups, and I took a extension writing class at UC Berkeley. But down in the Monterey Peninsula area, there's this heritage of the writers, John Steinbeck, and poets were here, Robinson Jeffers being one.
Robert Louis Stevenson.
And Robert Louis Stevenson spent time here.
Kerouac.
And Kerouac, of course, down in Big Sur. And Joseph Campbell spent time in Pacific Grove. And when I say here, that's obvious that we're recording this in Monterey.
Henry Miller.
Yeah. And on and on. And then the painters, Armand Hansen and those guys. And then, of course, the photographers, Edward Weston and Ansel Adams and the whole what they call Monterey School. So we came down here into an environment that was rich with this tradition and this history. And, our house is, 10 miles from where Ansel lived. It's just over the hill from where Steinbeck lived. So it's...
And Dylan camped out in Carmel Valley and wrote songs here.
He did.
Yeah.
Dylan and Joan Baez was here. And Joan Baez had a school here in Carmel Valley. And Robert Louis Stevenson stayed for a long period of time in a hotel boarding house that's around the corner from where the monthly poetry readings are held. So there's that tradition, and so it kind of, I guess it's a chicken and egg thing. It kind of encouraged me to open up and explore, which is something I needed and wanted to do. And it's probably genetic because one of my grandfathers was a poet and a writer, and my dad was a good writer, and my dad's mother was a good writer. So I think things came together. It was kind of like the perfect combination.
I find, I was up in the Bay Area doing some interviews and came down to visit you guys. Once you get south of Gilroy, it just opens up.
Yes.
It opens up and the highways get smaller, and it's not country, but you feel like you could be in the Midwest or up in, Arcata. You feel like this space. And it was interesting seeing this as your son, as you became, less stressed out, and obviously there are work pressures and stuff, but we have and had a good relationship, and you always made time for me. And there's that Cats in the Cradle song, which I always, so sad. And I never felt like that was part of our experience. I remember you'd always, when you're home, you would have time to draw with me,
Yes, right.
And we'd have we'd have special day of we'd build like a chair for my Roger Rabbit toy, or we'd draw, and you were like, okay, it's Andrew Daddy time, and you would do that. And I think about how it makes me sad to think about people who maybe didn't have that experience, and how if I ever became a father, I would really make time for my son or daughter. And, mom's a big part of that too. We haven't even touched on her, and I'm going to do an episode on her, but that you and her were such a great team, because she taught me to love literature, but you always both made time for each other. And how, you have been with Mom 50 years now.
Yeah, we've been married 50 years.
That's a great model on like a great relationship. And I hope Ashley and I can surpass that too, How did you balance your incredibly stressful traveling career with this fantastic relationship?
That was hard work. Not hard work. It was work. I think we had to be conscious of, and still do, of each other's needs. I think the fundamental element in any relationship is communication, coupled with respect for the other person, and all bound up with love for that person. And that's kind of a platitudinous way of saying it, but I think what you do with that sort of as your underlying ethos, if you will, you then make your choices and your decisions accordingly. And I can remember, it wasn't easy to travel. I would get on a plane, and I remember one trip I came back from Suriname, and I had to go to Tokyo, and I saw Mom for an hour and a half at SFO between planes, and I was kind of toast. And she came over, and we just had a little time together. And I have on a shelf here a piece of wood, driftwood, that we picked up at Point Reyes on Drake's Beach there, on a walk we took on a Sunday before I went out on some a worldwide trip, and I took that piece of wood with me, and I would take it with me ever since as a kind of a souvenir or a talisman or something. And so I think you have to you have to communicate, you have to respect, and for me, life began again when Mom and I got married. And then for the two of us, life began again when you and your sister were born. And I think you govern yourself accordingly.
What were the first 5 years of being a dad like?
Oh, they were a challenge. The first few months were the hardest part. The sleep deprivation was something that I didn't expect. And I've said, I would have confessed to any crime you confronted me with back then because I was just so unused to getting up every 3 or 4 hours or however often it was. And so it was an adjustment. But it was always, we didn't have you guys when we were young. We were a little older, and so you were very wanted, and we knew what a treasure and a blessing you were and are. So we adjusted accordingly. But it was different, and during those first 5 years, when you were about 3 years old, maybe. Castle and Cook, my company, was taken over in the takeover wars of the 80s, and I was ultimately no longer there and had a lot of time at home while I was realigning my career, and I got to be Mr. Mom, and that was great fun. It almost became to the point where when someone would come to pick you up to go to somewhere with a play date or something, I'd be there in my fuzzy slippers and hair curlers. I mean, it wasn't quite that, but it was great. And I think, the thing is, we didn't let go of any of the things that we were doing and that were important to us, as in career or other pursuits, and certainly our relationship to each other. We just had to narrow our focus because we had something else on our plate, which was you guys. And that actually was the most important item on the plate, you guys. And so we adjusted everything accordingly. But we did things like we had a date night once a week, and a lovely lady would come in and sit you guys. And then we did things as a family, increasingly. And Mom was great, because I would be gone for, say, 2 weeks at a time, sometimes longer. And back then there was no web. There were no cell phones, and the only way you could communicate when some of the obscure places I was in was by telex, but that would go through the company communications center, so I certainly wasn't going to be communicating with Mom by telex, and occasionally we would get to talk on the phone, but not much because it was hard to make a phone connection and it was expensive. So Mom, carried the ball a lot. Logistically and emotionally with you guys when I was away. And then I certainly made sure that when I was here, and over time my travel dialed back, I certainly made time when I was here to pick up the slack and actually give Mom a break and spend time with you guys, which I really wanted and needed to do.
And I remember she would take an annual spa trip for a week.
Yes, she would go with the ladies. Yeah,
and that was always like her sanity, her piece of sanity.
Mom's R&R. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Because I had my sister on an old podcast episode back when I first started. She and I are definitely unique, and I was definitely very active and hyperactive, and we definitely we pushed each other's buttons for fun, but I had this, being the little brother, I always would tease her and like poke her, and it must have been having the two of us when we would not get along. That must have been one of the harder parts of having us. I don't know.
Yeah, it was a challenge at times. I mean, we sometimes felt like we had to referee.
I would get tattled on for little things, and then I would like pretend I didn't start the war, but I'd always like throw the match on, and then I would love to get a reaction out of my sister.
Yeah, there was that, but I think you guys, um, the basic watchword in the family was respect for each other, and uh, at times the referee job got a little challenging, and mom or I would just basically order you to stop it and work it out, and you guys did. And you have a wonderful sister, and you guys have a really good relationship, and you're both fantastic, albeit unique and different people.
I think growing up with my sister taught me to kind of be sensitive and understand women a little bit more. And
Mm-hmm.
when I was, dating and in college, I think if I'd been an only child, I wouldn't, or if I had a brother, it would have been harder to kind of understand, like, and every person is different, but yeah, learning how to listen and learning how to share.
Mm-hmm.
That was very important because you guys were always very fair. And yeah, so having two kids was, I guess I wasn't planned, was I?
Well, you were certainly desired,
Yeah.
and you came earlier than we expected, which was just fantastic. And and I think there is something. I grew up with a sister too, and I don't. It's probably maybe not PC to say boys and girls are different, but they are. I think psychologists would agree with that in terms of just cognitive function and the way girls and boys are. And I know a lot of that is uh, socialization and so forth. But at least in our case, in our family, you and your sister did approach life differently. You see things differently. You process differently. You are governed by different aspects of your hearts and your minds, and so those differences were manifest early on in your lives. And I think what was important in our family was for you each to respect those differences in the other and not to denigrate the other on account of them, and to appreciate each other. And that's one of the things that Mom and I really are happy and grateful for, is that you and your sister do appreciate each other and respect each other.
One of the last things before we wrap up and talk about where people can find you and find your work, I now something I really value and am so thankful for is ever since we were kids, you guys had this fantastic rule of no Nintendo, no computer games, no TV during the week. If we did our homework, we could play on Friday, and then on the weekends for only a half hour to an hour. And I think about now, a potential parent would be you have to like confiscate screens. Everything's so portable and easy to hide. And when we got a Game Boy, that was different. Like in the car, you'd let us play, but you wouldn't. I had so many friends who'd be like, "Did you see this show, that show?" You'd let us watch The Simpsons when it switched to
Yes,
Thursday,
right.
but that was really it. And I think that forced me to read a lot,
Mhm.
to draw a lot, to start making music, to spend time with my friends. I kind of feel like we had this Calvin and Hobbes sort of outdoor exploration where those childhood memories that afforded me are priceless. And I think that's given me a very rich, happy adulthood.
Mhm.
And that was really, really smart. And, it made us maybe uncool with our friends that we didn't watch MTV all day. But I think it then led to me to be fascinated with popular culture and to make my appreciation of it being how I remixed it, how I commented on it, and then my series of lit hop songs and how I'm
Mhm.
doing this series
Mhm.
of projects based on specific authors. That there was, you had to, if you were going to have a relationship with media, it had to be contextual, it had to be finite, and it had to be in service of something else, or it had to be purposeful. And I think that I don't think I would have turned out like I did, and I don't think I would have, gotten into the college I did if I'd screwed around. And
Mhm.
everyone's different, but was that conscious? And like, how did you and Mom come to terms on that?
Well, yes, it was conscious. We were aware of the pervasive power of media, We'd both grown up in households where we got TVs when we were kids. We got a TV in America when I was 11 years old, and all of a sudden, there's this thing in the house. And I think in Mom's case, it was about that same age for her. Then there was debate going on back then too about television becoming too dominant in people's lives, and so we believed and still do that electronic media, as wonderful as they are, need to be constrained. And I think of articles I've read about Steve Jobs and others in Silicon Valley send their kids to a school where laptops,
no screens.
No screens. And if anybody should know why that's good not to have screens, those guys would. And we just saw last week the movie Eighth Grade, which is a wonderful, painful movie. It took me so back to that. But I was struck by the way in which the screens are so present, if not intrusive, in the lives of all of those kids. And I have read about this psychological diagnosis now called device addiction. And we didn't want that to happen. And it wasn't called that back then, but we saw there was value in things beyond just sitting in front of a screen. And this was well before personal computers, and certainly before smartphones and things like that. But we did, we were on the cutting edge of that. We got computers in the home, and we got onto Prodigy and things like that. But it's like any good thing. Too much is too much, and so we kept it narrowed and limited. And I think one of the consequences was, as you said, you read books, and you've got your great song about sitting on the couch with Mom reading books.
Yeah.
In our house in Oakland. So it's a wonderful thing. Media are great. Screens are great, but like any good thing, you don't want to OD on them.
I remember there was a game, Mario Paint, for Super Nintendo, where you could compose music in it. And I spent time doing that. And I think like all that led to, you guys were supportive. You let me take guitar lessons and everything. And yeah, it was just, your parenting was A+. And I hope,
thank you so much.
if I ever become a dad, that I can kind of learn from you and check in with you on like what worked, what didn't. And it's different now, but at the same time, it's not that different if you keep these old values and really are present in your kid's life and love him or her and figure out how to balance work with your personal time, and whether it's personal therapy or health or wellness. And you meditate every day still, don't you?
I do. Yeah. I find that essential. And it's really, I'm not a Zen practitioner in the strict sense of the word, but I did learn, 40 years ago, that there is value in being centered, which is what meditation allows you to do. In fact, back then, this thing called transcendental meditation was taking root. TM, and the Beatles got into it with the Maharishi. But I found Zen books by writers like Alan Watts that were very appealing to me, and I think that's important. I think that does help you keep a balance, and so you go from there. And we talked to our parents as we were raising you guys, and they gave us some guidance, and I have every confidence that when and if you guys have you and Ashley have kids, you'll do great. Yeah, you'll talk to us at times, but and it's a different world, but you'll do great. I think having an honest heart is the essential prerequisite for that, and for anything really in life.
And another thing is, you never, as a man who doesn't drink, and you never imbibed in any you weren't distracted by any like dangerous substances. You kept your head clear, and that was a great role model. I mean, you always showed up. And
Yeah, I used to party and enjoy adult beverages, but they after I don't know 25 years ago, I realized they didn't agree with me, and so I stopped. But we have in our family a history of alcohol issues going back generations, and I think we've seen what that has done to family members. We've also seen the flip side of what family members have so wonderfully and beautifully achieved by getting on their path, some of them through 12-step programs, some of them simply through faith and strength of their own, just doing it on their own. And we've seen the goodness and the richness that comes out of a life that is not really captive of external things, in this case, substances, alcohol or drugs. But, lives can be captured by other things too. There can be addictions of all kind. And we've seen, I think, in our family and the examples given to us of what happens when you do allow yourself to be captured. And on the flip side, what happens so wonderfully and beautifully when you don't allow it and when you instead come home to who you really are and you live life authentically and honestly from your center, with or without the support of a 12-step group or your faith or your family or whatever. But you come home to yourself and you live authentically. And I think that's what it's about.
And you can come home and do authentic podcasts with people you love.
Exactly.
Dad, yeah. I wanted to end to share this story. Yesterday when I was driving down to interview Charlie for his talk about his DJ career, I drove over the Golden Gate Bridge and it was still sunny. It was a beautiful day, like coming. They call that tunnel now the Robin Williams Tunnel.
Yes, so neat.
Which is awesome.
Yeah.
And I remember I drove over the Golden Gate Bridge, and it's just always captivating that when you drive in, and then once you pass through and the Presidio's on your left, and there's that view of it. Mm-hmm. I remember, fourth grade trips, and when we built the model of the Golden Gate Bridge, and all our connection to the Bay Area, and why I always wear the Oakland A's hat, because we still go to A's games. And
yeah, we do.
I remember they came. This is a side story. I tweeted that I was there, and since they follow me, they came. The social media team came and gave us hats and shirts.
That game, yeah.
It was dope.
That last year, yeah.
It's the Bay Area is special, and the Golden Gate is a connection to the Pacific, which is a connection to Hawaii, where you stopped over on your first trip, to California, where you did so much of your business career as a corporate lawyer, and Australia.
Absolutely.
And New Zealand, where our ancestors came from Denmark and Scotland and Europe. And those places, New Zealand has always called to my heart. And the family reunion we had with all our cousins in Melbourne this year was amazing. And we drove over, and I remember right after 9/11, when your father died, my grandpa, we took his ashes and we went out, and we had to delay the spreading the ashes in the sea because of 9/11.
Right.
And I remember we tossed them in there and we played like the military music. And whenever I cross the Golden Gate Bridge, I think of him. And I waved to him.
Of my dad.
Yeah.
Your grandpa.
And
yeah.
because he's always there under the bridge, and the story of him flying over the Sydney Harbor Bridge, or his friends flying over under it on his wedding day to surprise him. And that connection, that our life is a series of bridges and travel and exploration and joy. And the Nielsen connection goes back so deep. And it makes me emotional because I miss him, and I miss when I'm in New York. I miss you guys, but that I really am thankful for how you've created these roots in California and allowed me to be myself and find myself. And coming home yesterday and kind of waving to Grandpa from the bridge was beautiful.
Yeah,
and none of that would have happened if you hadn't gotten your life together to make this possible. and to spread this legacy to another generation. And I just appreciate you, Dad. I wanted to say that. I didn't expect to get so emotional, but I miss you when I'm in New York.
Well, thank you, mate, and we miss you too, and Ashley, and we count among our richest blessings are you and your sister and Ashley and all the goodness in life. And I think this is family at its best, and our family is kind of amazing. I mean, we have been nomadic over the generations, from Australia, Scotland, Denmark to New Zealand to America, and it's quite something. And I also think too that your grandfather's, my dad's ashes, which we did scatter there off the coast outside the Golden Gate, they've also probably drifted now to Australia and New Zealand, at least figuratively. And we do have an amazing family. And I think one of the neat things is that, thank God, nowadays we can keep the connections. And yes, we miss you and Ashley a lot when you're back in New York. But thank God there are things like FaceTime that help bridge the distance, to use the bridge metaphor again. And not like it was in the old days when our ancestors emigrated from Scandinavia to New Zealand. They never saw their family again. And so we don't have that. We have the miracle of again, technology and screens that keep us together. And so it's great. It's been fun growing up with you. And I look forward to doing that for decades to come.
We wrote a song about a son and his father who communicate over distance, and it's called Soledad.
Yeah.
And do you want to introduce it? Because we'll end this podcast with our rap collaboration.
Oh, marvelous. Yeah, sure. Soledad, there's a mission out in the Salinas Valley, just over the mountains here from us, that was founded by the Franciscans as they moved north and built their missions in California in the 1700s. And Soledad is solitary and alone in a kind of a windswept part of the Salinas Valley. And there's a mission further south and San Antonio, and then there's one to the north in Carmel. And Soledad was kind of an out-of-the-way place. And we visited that, you and I and Mom, and the loneliness and the desolation struck us. And so you and I collaborated, and this story came to us. I was so impressed with the way the story just poured out from you onto paper, and I helped. The story, and then we recorded it, and
you tracked your vocals in the Rondo Brothers studio, where we did Digital Gangster LP and part of Robot Kills and Single and Famous and Zombie Dinosaur LP. And after they remodeled it, you were the first vocalist to use that booth.
Oh, well, that's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And it was neat. And you were so patient. I know you were using the software for the soundboard, and we did your take. Your part of the tracks in 20 minutes, half an hour. It took all day for me, the rest of the day, to get mine down. But it was great fun. And it's the story of a son who is a priest, who has fathered a child and left the child back in Spain. And the priest has been basically kind of exiled to Soledad, where he's alone and by himself.
As a punishment, because priests have to be celibate.
Exactly. And he was atoning for his sin, and he's communicating with his father, who was a professor at the University of Salamanca in Spain, and the father knew Junipero Serra, who was the founder of the California missions. And so there's some interplay in all of that, mixing history with creative nonfiction. But it's basically a story about fathers and sons and connection, and the importance of love and maintaining those connections.
And the beat was produced by Samurai from Portland. And what's great about the beat is it kind of has this science fiction, sci-fi, anime haunting horn. And it's this thing about Soledad that's so gorgeous. If you go to this, the Central Coast and go in and down the valley, the stars are just
Yes.
remarkable.
Yeah.
So it's a father and a son writing each other, looking at the stars. And I remember when we were kids, going to summer camp, sitting on your lap and looking at the stars, and you said, Andrew, somewhere across the galaxy, there's probably another creature with the sun looking out the stars and thinking about how there's another dad and son marveling in this magic universe.
Yes.
And so that song channels that, because it's distance and the letters take forever to get to each other, but this father and his son keep in touch. And when I made Lars Attacks and Indie Rocket Science, I was in Brooklyn and I was about to do the Warped Tour, and it's how I felt far away from you, but also we worked on this song, and it was a standout track on that mixtape for sure.
Yeah, it's a great track.
And you have fans when we do shows, you've opened for me reading your poetry, and you often do Mr. Raven,
Yes.
and like people, especially in the Bay Area, when I play a show, you're not there. People are like crestfallen. Where's your dad? Because you're always at the merch booth and signing autographs.
Where's MC Bob?
People love you, Dad. And
thank you, mate.
That's fun to have you on stage. You are prolific on social media. Let's talk about where our podcast listeners can find your work.
Oh, well, I do have a website. It's Pilgrim, the word Pilgrim, Pilgrim-Arts, pilgrim-arts.com. I'm on Facebook as Robert Nielsen, Nielsen, and I'm on Instagram. It's just simply one word, Robert Nielsen Instagram. And I'm on Twitter under Robert Nielsen.
Sorry, on Twitter, you're Robert Nielsen #1.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Robert Nielsen and then just the Arabic #1, huh?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm lucky I got that.
Yeah.
And I post, if I post an image, and usually they're photographs that I post on my website, and they start with a Facebook post and a concurrent Instagram and Twitter or tweet, and then they go onto my website, and the website is a little bit behind schedule, and that's where you can see my stuff.
Your website's cool because it has it's a little bit about your career as a lawyer, very little, and then all your writing, and you have themes, and it's we're trying to get you on Squarespace, but it's so content rich and well laid out that it's a process to update.
Yeah, we'll figure that out. I use iWeb, which Apple no longer supports, and I see that they're going from, I guess, 12-bit processing up to whatever the next level is, and so iWeb is definitely not going to be supported in the next OS upgrade for Macs, and so I've got to get off it. But I'm researching, and you and I've talked about Squarespace, and then there is a successor platform apparently created by a bunch of people who were at Apple and did work on iWeb, and so I'm going to explore that too.
And so check it out while you can, because it's in the process
please.
of changing. And you do performances and you post when you do them. So maybe some of the fans, if they're visiting California, can see you perform.
Well, April 14th next year, I'm going to be doing a poetry reading in Monterey.
Okay.
So I'll put that up on Facebook and other posts. And yeah, so love to see folks.
Well, thank you, Dad. This has been a really special episode, and I want to thank you. I know you're busy, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's great, mate, and appreciate your time. And it's always a pleasure.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm writing to you. Still stuck in Soledad, I'm lonely, Dad, it's true. Hope you'll come home when your mission is through. There's nothing but stars in the lonely solitude. Dear son, Salamanca's still been the same, 6,000 miles away, but I still feel your pain. Adventure and duty did what was required. Your life in the new world, our tired empire. Dear father, thanks for writing. Not much is new, just heat, wind, and rain, and the lonely solitude. The priesthood is difficult, it's driving me insane. Hypocrisy, it's not for me, and every night I dream of Spain.
And the son that you sired, that I've been left to raise, is looking more like you every week, every day. And it's you that I see when I look in his eyes. Every day he grows taller. Last week he turned 5.
It's just me and my thoughts, and the stars up in the sky. It's silent and mysterious and peaceful every single night. I was martyred for my sins when I fathered a son. So they sent me on a mission, but I really wish I could run away.
I'm writing to you.
Still stuck in Soledad, I'm lonely, Dad, it's true.
Hope you'll come home when your mission is through.
There's nothing but stars in the lonely solitude.
1802, I'm writing to you.
Still stuck in Soledad, I'm lonely, Dad, it's true.
Hope you'll come home when your mission is through.
There's nothing but stars in the lonely solitude. Dear Father, I fear that my faith is slowly fading. We brought the native smallpox and mentally enslaved them with our teachings from the Bible. Guilt, sin, salvation, Trinitarian, cruel agrarians on this here plantation.
Dear son, I knew Sarah. We were friends. He chose church. Many souls to redeem after damning them first. Built missions. My mission was spreading the light. At the university, you can see me teaching these young minds.
San Diego, Sonoma, so much more beautiful. It was you who taught loyalty, said to be beautiful. They say in Carmel that the water's so blue, and it's true. If I could, I would swim home to you.
Your walls made of mud, the Indians have built. Adobe, well, it's mostly straw, dirt, and silt. The wind and the rain will bring the walls down. God's glory gone, and loneliness your crown. 1802, I'm writing to you.
Still stuck in Soledad, I'm lonely, Dad, it's true.
Hope you'll come home when your mission is through.
There's nothing but stars in the lonely solitude.
1802, I'm writing to you.
Still stuck in Soledad, I'm lonely, Dad, it's true.
Hope you'll come home when your mission is through.
There's nothing but stars in the lonely solitude. Ventana to the south, Gabilons to the east. There's beauty in our home, though it sometimes seems bleak. To the glory of Spain, we remain and maintain this edifice, our testament to faith, love, and pain.
A cathedral, you say, that you want to be built on the plains of Soledad, one day to be filled with the faithful of California who've not got a clue. But Mexico will be free from Spain, and so, my son, will you?
Tears on my cheeks, lágrimas, arroyo seco. The wind and the rain, la tierra y el fuego. La cara de Dios me da un gran sonrisa. Lo miro cada día en la Santa Lucias.
Choose then to return, for your work out there's done. King and church have been served, and the race has been won. Dispensation from above, you've earned it, my son. Come home now to family, come home to my love. 1802, I'm writing to you.
Still stuck in Soledad, I'm lonely, Dad, it's true.
Hope you'll come home when your mission is through.
There's nothing but stars in the lonely solitude.
1802, I'm writing to you.
Still stuck in Soledad, I'm lonely, Dad, it's true.
Hope you'll come home when your mission is through.
There's nothing but stars in the lonely solitude.
Dear son.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Dad. I appreciate you being on the podcast. Next week, guess what? I'm interviewing my mom, DJ Kathy Nielsen, back-to-back holiday special. So we've got a lot of great podcasts coming up. So please, if you like this episode, please leave a comment. Please subscribe. Please spread the word. I want to give a shout out to my Patreon supporters, as I always do. Some of my new ones. Shout out to Jay Lucas. Shout out to Steven. And also, shout out to Daniel. Like, Daniel's came to most of my shows, like all my shows actually, when I did my residency in New York. And I was at a Streetlight Manifesto show, and randomly, he's there. He goes, Lars. I'm like, Daniel. So, shout out to him. And his cousin went to high school with me, David. So, that's crazy. Also, some old school supporters. Shout out to Chad, Jen, and Jason. I have coming out in a few days the final song on the Narnia EP about the last battle, which is kind of like a song about how I imagine heaven would look like through a Narnian perspective. It's wild stuff. Anyway, check it out. Thank you again for listening. I hope you all have a great week, and more flavor coming soon. Take care. Bye.